Hello, everybody. Nice to see you again. The 2021 Singapore Fintech Festival is still ongoing, and we're having some great conversations about new innovations, developments, and trends in the fintech space. I'm Lynette here, a venture lead for SC Ventures, and I focus on advancing ESG integration standards and spearheading collaborative ventures with industries. Today, I'll be the moderator for this thought leadership discussion, and I'm really excited to share this unique topic we'll be discussing about, which is called the economics of biodiversity. So sustainability is talked about often in the context of fintech, and is a really broad subject with a lot to unpack. Issues like financing climate change, decarbonization, and mitigating other types of environmental impacts are commonly mentioned. But one less common subject is biodiversity. Biodiversity is just as important as any other issues under the sustainability umbrella, and the fintech industry can contribute to biodiversity conversation. With features such as tokenization and digital financing, even ordinary citizens can be empowered to support biodiversity goals through their financial decision-making process. So most people can only invest in biodiversity through donations or indirectly through particular pension funds with relevant allocations. But fintech, we can leverage on the data to address specific investment challenge faced by nature-based assets and design avenues to scale biodiversity finance. So currently, more than 55% of fintech for biodiversity solutions are blockchain-powered, and it'll be interesting for us to hear what thought leaders like Corrado and Benjamin, who are here with us today, about how they think and tokenization play a part in this space. So welcome, Corrado and Benjamin. So maybe can we learn a little bit more about yourselves today and how you started your journey with Paya Consultancy and with Wave Financial?
Thank you, Lynette, and everyone out there. A very good afternoon from Singapore. My name is Corrado. I'm a director at Paya Consulting, Paya being a sustainability specialist, working with a number of services pertaining to primarily the integration of sustainability into business and strategies. And to today's topic, I'm also a limited partner into a venture fund investing into blockchain companies. And that's where probably I got thrilled by the idea of sharing some of my thoughts pertaining to the economics of biodiversity and the possibility of tokenizing it. Benjamin, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, my name is Benjamin Tsai. I'm one of the founders and the president of Wave Financial. We're an SEC registered investment advisor here in the US, and we run over $1 billion of assets under management, purely focused on blockchain and cryptocurrencies. In terms of my journey being here, I spent about 15 years in traditional finance across various parts of Asia, including Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan and Taiwan. And really, after that, I went down the rabbit hole of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. I found it extremely interesting. I found the efficiency of using blockchain across the financial system to be really exciting, and I'm looking forward to discussing that further with everyone here on the panel.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Maybe we could kick off with a little bit about the NFTs and what's going on in the crypto scene. Like maybe to Benjamin, can I just check with you, what are the thematic investments that the crypto crowd are looking into in 2021?
Sure. Yeah, I think NFT is a big topic right now. I'm not sure if there's as much in the the biodiversity angle with regards to that, but NFT is exciting really more from the empowering of artists and really trying to skip the people in the middle in terms of margins and so forth. As an example, I think one of the big highlights of the technology around NFTs is the fact that there's a residual component that goes back to the original creator, and for every transaction that happens. And if you can imagine, Picasso is actually owed a lot of residuals if he was to ever get a cut of his work. All subsequent transactions, he's not really involved financially. So the blockchain and the NFT space is trying to solve problems like that, and really making sure that the original creators are credited for something, related to the efforts that they put in for the work. And from that perspective, I find that space quite interesting.
It is very interesting. Do you think you can share with us what's the push towards this trend? Like, what are the drivers that actually created this huge amount of growth?
I think a part of it comes from the fact that there is a group of crypto wealthy who's really driving this market forward, and they are very much into group thinking, very much into consensus across a decentralized system. They're into rewarding the original source of creative ideas really on a group basis, and because of that, this system really is being developed with that in mind, and the really crypto savvy are very much enjoying that, and they're taking the leading edge of that. And the rest of the art world is really following on with that. For example, Christie's, was very instrumental in a major auction earlier this year in March, where they auctioned Beeple's piece, I think 5,000 days of art. And, that was sold at Christie's for $69 million. It was purchased by a crypto enthusiast using crypto for payment. And, in that auction, I believe 48 or 49 people bid on it. Over 20 of them bid over $1 million. And out of that, a very small percentage, I think only 3 or 4 of them are existing Christie's clients. The rest are all new clients that they never had access to. So I find that to be very exciting, really bringing the new wealth into traditional art and bring the traditional investors into digital art.
Wow, that's impressive. I didn't know about this Christie's auction and the new clients that came in and not the existing books, right? This is really fun. Okay, shall we push it towards the ESG tokenization? Shall we discuss about this tokenization, potential tokenization of ESG hard assets? So maybe you could share a little bit between Corrado and yourself about that.
Yeah, I can pick up on something that Benjamin mentioned on the NFT, and trying to draw a parallel to the biodiversity and more in particular. I think this concept of creating and co-creating, getting access to IP rights is a fascinating idea, that if we are thinking about nature as a public good, and we are thinking about nature as with all its genetic information and everything that we can do around preserving the biodiversity and the biological diversity of a species, then of course you can look at it from the angle of IPs being almost like the genome, the DNA informations that are captured. And can we, as an open question, can we tokenize those genetic informations, those DNA informations, as a way to incentivize the protection of a public good, being nature? And if so, how will that tokenization then happen? Because you will have a public good, but you also have a bit conflictual perspective in the fact that you still want to share data openly for research. COVID-19 is a good example, right, with the vaccination. If we wouldn't have had an openly sharing of data across countries, we may not have got to a vaccine as fast as we got to. So if we are tokenizing it and we start taking ownership of intellectual properties pertaining to a particular species in a particular country, how do we balance it, right? So I think I can see a lot of interest around the tokenization of biodiversity, but I also see the challenges of it.
Yep, totally agree. So maybe Benjamin, you can share with us what has been done so far about tokenization of ESG hard assets, and what do you see are the potential challenges from your perspective in the NFT space?
Sure. I think the tokenization business actually has been going on for the past few years, and Singapore is one of the leading markets in that. And there's actually a lot of work also being done in the U.S. And it kicked off really, based on tokenization of hard assets such as real estate and so forth. And those are kind of the initial stages. And after that, I think people have been looking at continuing more on real estate. I don't think that demand is abating, but also looking at some other assets that can be included on the tokenization that would be of interest to people. So as an example, we as a firm have tokenized American whiskey, really from an investment perspective, and really something fun to do. And we've also looked at tokenization of carbon credit. And I know in Singapore there's actually a specific exchange that trades tokenized carbon credit on the blockchain. And that's certainly a very direct way of connecting with the ESG market from that perspective.
Okay. So there are use cases in tokenizing assets that is related to sustainability. How can we bring forth in biodiversity? So Corrado, what do you think will be the potential challenge in trying to tag this biodiversity to NFT?
Yeah, I think going back to point also raised by Benjamin on the American whiskey, I think it made me think a little bit, because imagine if we could tokenize protected species. Now I know that pandas are no longer under risk of extinctions, but to just play around the idea that we will be tokenizing a panda as a species that needs protection because it plays a part in the biodiversity, and it plays a part pertaining to this biological diversity in DNA, genomes, all type of information, genetic informations that are relevant. And again, I can see that by tokenizing it, you get the possibility of incentivizing people to protect the public good, panda being nature, being a public good. I can see that as a very good way of actually pushing forward the agenda pertaining to protecting and conserving nature and biodiversity. If I'm flipping it over, I think the challenge is really about creating a market that may not be an open market anymore, because you're basically creating a tradable assets, which gives, again, from the incentive rewarding makes sense, but from the more social aspect of sharing data openly, and thereby creating a market where countries can use specific genetic informations that are deriving from that panda for research that goes into into a vaccine. I think technology can help us understanding how to bridge that challenge of having something that will be privately owned with a public good that is actually at the service of a community, right? So in my mind, this is where I'm spending quite a little bit of time to understand the economics of biodiversity and trying to really understand where do you see NFT and if we are thinking about pandas being a unique species, it makes sense that you will have a non-fungible token, and you can almost collect that token because it has a value. So you give nature a value, and I think that's very important because we don't have that value today. On the other side, the challenge is really how do we go about the fact that if we should have a similar pandemic as we have today, and everyone has a sovereignty on the panda that has been tokenized, how do we share those data? Yeah, and there are protocols today, and there are conventions that are regulating it. But what will be the extensiveness of an open source type of environment where we can actually get access to those data as and when we need them?
Okay. So
I think on a more frivolous angle, and I'm based in Los Angeles, it's 11 p.m. here, so I get to say things that are a little more frivolous.
You get a whiskey too.
Yeah, so I'm sure if we went and tokenized the ownership of panda, that those tokens would sell quite well, especially if they're connected with real pandas. And really from a fractional ownership perspective, you don't actually get to have the panda at your house and everything, just like people are doing fractionalized art, and you don't actually get to hang the art on your wall because you own a fractional share. So it's really more from a philanthropic angle. But on paper, it is real fractional ownership of such a panda, and I think that would potentially be interesting. And to make it a little bit less than just playing with it, but more on a financial basis. Certainly, if there was any research done on the panda, or if there are any revenues generated from panda, for example, people started selling panda t-shirts relating to that specific panda, the revenue can then be flowed back to the token holders and so forth. And I certainly think that something like that could be applicable for endangered species, to try to help fundraise to support an environment, an ecosystem to for those endangered species. And I think for those token owners, they would be incentivized to want to make sure that the endangered species don't go away, because obviously as owners, they would feel an obligation to protect that.
Yeah. Actually, one thing that I think we had a little chat about it was the potential of digital sequencing information. Could it actually be an interesting area that could solidify the NFTs, for that matter? That would be quite interesting to think and discuss through. And how could it maybe potentially provide the rights, and like what Corrado mentioned earlier, to secure the IP to it, right? Because it goes beyond panda. I mean, we're using that as an example. It could be a plant species that could help in the vaccines or many other things for that. So can we actually do something about it in terms of NFT, to use like digital sequencing or to secure that IP right to it, and then how to link it back to real value in economic sense?
Yeah, I think a little bit back to Benjamin's point. Tokenizing to me is really the ability of giving value to something that we may not necessarily, where we are not necessarily able to give a value per se. So that's where I think this tokenizing nature and biodiversity makes sense intuitively, because it will create a market where you will be able to put that value to something, whether being a species, a panda, a forest, and thereby monetizing it, creating a reward and an incentive for people to protect, because all of a sudden you don't feel that you need to deforest or hunt to the same extent, because you have a revenue stream. So that makes sense to me. On the digital sequence is a very interesting area that is highly regulated by conventions and protocols, because you have every species, every animal, every living plant has a genetic information that contains information relevant for agri, for food, for marine biodiversity, for health. And one of the big discussions out there is, if you have a species, something in your biodiversity. So let's take Indonesia as a country. You might have a particular species that is so important from a digital sequence information perspective, because it contains information that are relevant for research. By tokenizing that information and having the IP, you are basically giving that sovereignty to Indonesia, and thereby you de facto you create an asset. And I think that's an important aspect of the tokenization of DSI, is this concept of creating digital assets that can be owned and borrowed to another country for research purposes. The risk, as I mentioned before, is what if you are in a crisis situation? You need to share things immediately. How do you get how do you get about it? Is regulation then what you need to have in place?
That's really a very interesting angle. Benjamin, do you have any views about it?
Yeah, I actually, since our conversation a few days ago, I've been thinking about that, and I find it, I think there are idealistic ways of talking about blockchain and NFTs, and be able to, put data on a smart contract so that people who pay for it get to access it and so forth. But I think, where the rubber meets the road is always very difficult. If you think about it, a password protected document could be sent from someone to somebody, but once you have the password, temporarily, once you access the document, you now have the information, the content that's there. It's kind of like the Pandora's box is open. How do you close it, right? How do you revoke that data from people? And I would say that it's probably difficult, if not impossible, to do that. So once valuable information is sold or is given from one party to a second one, there's no way to take that back. And I think that that's what makes it a little bit tricky in terms of, from a tokenization perspective, because even if that person sells off that token to the next person, the seller doesn't release the data, right? The seller can still hold on to copies of the data and so forth. So I'm sure someone who's very smart with cryptography can potentially figure out a solution to that. But I think that would just fundamentally be a difficult point that would need to be solved.
Yeah, and maybe, Benjamin, the creation of marketplaces that are regulated, almost like a DNA marketplace where those tokens, now I know we're discussing about non-fungible tokens, but maybe they will have some element of credibility still for medical purposes, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the non-fungibility point is what makes all of these tokens and the blockchain and so forth so unique, right?
Yep.
With the unique existence of every single Bitcoin, every single cryptocurrency, if I pass something to you, I necessarily lose my ownership of it, my copy of it. And that's unique because normally in a digital data, when I send you an email, I also have another copy sitting in my sent folder. And when you receive it, you have it in your folder, you forward it to somebody. You and I do not lose the ownership, even though the third person receives it. And so the traditional way of thinking about data is much more linear and is digitally reproducible. And that innately is something that I guess is the problem, in the sense that you want to have data that once there's a resale, then the seller doesn't continue to hold on to a copy of it, because that reduces its value, right? So that, I think that's what we're talking about. So yeah, I'm sure there's more innovative ways to try to lock that down, but that's really where the rubber meets the road, and that's the difficulty with using the blockchain in the traditional space and how the two interact.
It's interesting. It's very much linked to the rights to the ownership per se, for that matter.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, and it's easier to enforce that from a regulatory perspective if it's very public. But if you're talking about genetic information that's locked up in a lab, who's to say they didn't keep another copy or not? It's hard to regulate that. You'd have to prove that they when they bought or sold, they had a copy, they didn't have a copy. It's quite tricky.
So it's the ability to actually package and create it like a transactional asset, for that matter. It would be very much like, if we take a use case from real estate, factorization, how can we actually get there with biodiversity? That'll be quite interesting to look at it, because it's effectively trying to create the tokenization into a hard asset and intensify the people to create public good, which is tapping on the consciousness and
That's right.
creating and tagging the rights, like a hashtag right to it for that.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah. So I mean, there's I think kind of bringing it back to kind of the ESG angle. There are carbon credit markets that are mandatory, and there are carbon credit markets that are voluntary. And unfortunately, the voluntary markets typically trade much lower and have less volume because people aren't required to do it. Whereas the mandatory markets are a much more higher price because there is the government regulation around that. So
yeah. So and that reinforced then, Lynette, back to your initial question on the DSI and the digital sequence information on genetic resources. That definitely needs to have a compliant market.
Yes.
In order to make sure that the informations are not only in line with the protocols of Nagoya, for example, when it comes to fair and equitable sharing of the benefits, but is also incentivizing countries, communities, landowners to actually protect, because they will be rewarded for it. They will have an incentive to protect rather than exploiting.
That's for sure. It might be interesting to actually start with certain aspects of biodiversity, which we could see the strong value that's related to public good, especially maybe in healthcare area or in vaccines and things that we could actually derive concrete results, because then it comes back to a point where can we take a rights to it, and we have a big need to actually protect this type of biodiversity as such, right? And that's when you can first start pushing and creating value. Is it too big a dream, Benjamin?
No, I think
I'm
those
just
are
trying
all,
to pull this
no,
whole
no.
train of thoughts.
Yeah, no, of course, and I think that
Yeah.
that would be very good if it's achievable, and I think that that's really interesting. And as we're discussing, I was thinking about how to make some of the information a bit more non-fungible, and that is, one-way transferable and so forth. So, there are probably ways around it, but certainly those are still under development, and regulations will probably come into play more. I think this is something the more classic crypto people are a little bit more freedom and anarchistic, but I think over the longer term, as it gets adopted across a wider population, I think regulations will set in the US is starting to do so, and certainly I think that is something that would become necessary.
Yeah. And also here, Benjamin, you just gave me something to think about, this regulation also pertaining to data. So one of the things that I was reading up, which I found quite interesting on the genetic information that we were discussing, is I'm not too sure how many millions of people they have been taking DNA swap tests to figuring out how their genomes and all mapping out. And all those data today are actually privately owned by companies that are providing those swap kit. And there is a market, of course, for all those data now going into research. And that's where I also see this tokenization playing a role in being able to protect some of your data. We are a little bit in now you can decide to encrypt the genomes, but you can also decide to encrypt the metadata, right? And that is an interesting aspect that you just made me think about when we are talking about regulation. If regulation should apply to tokenization of biodiversity, of that hard asset, will it happen on the genetic information, so on the data that are available, or will it take more a kind of a metadata approach?
Yeah, so I'll jump in there. I think I probably read a similar article. I think it was referring to I think it was a Bloomberg article or something like that, where it's 23andMe. When they do these ancestry tests or genetic sickness tests and so forth, for people to get their results, they usually sign away the rights to the data. And once they sign away with the data, 23andMe owns that data. And they've taken it one step further. Instead of trying to share that data, they're actually trying to use that data for development of medical and so forth. So I think one thing, just kind of leading back to the original discussion that we were having initially on NFTs, it may make sense to set up, an NFT that is your genetic data, and you become. Artist is the wrong word, but just to compare to a previous example, you become the artist as the owner, as the creator of the NFT with your genetic information in it. And in it, whenever there is a transaction or when the data is used, there is a residual of some sort that gets charged. And the person that owns that genetic data, if it is used in the future for some purpose, there would be a stream of royalties that come back for it. So instead of just signing up one time and be done with it, you're trading your DNA in exchange for some kind of information about your ancestry or your chance of having genetic diseases. You're actually getting a stream of cash flow that comes in, and that may be actually a lot more valuable to a lot more of the population of the world. And at the same time, that'll drive more people to want to have their DNA data be available. And I'm not sure if I personally want to do that, but certainly having that residual component does make it interesting for people.
Yeah, and then you can imagine now scaling this approach to nature. you can, nature is scalable and accessible. So now you can imagine if we do the same for every species, every plant, everything that has that we want to protect, you create that ownership.
Yeah, so I guess then that kind of leads to the question of who owns nature, right? So there's kind of there comes then it gets into a bit of a philosophical discussion. So yes.
So now we're trying to do a DSI on the DNA and some CSI work on it itself in this whole discussion. Singaporeans, so we love our abbreviations. It's really interesting, this discussion, because it's tough. I hear you, Benjamin, you're saying that it's very hard because tagging a right to it is the question. How are we going to tag this rights to it? It's got to be a lot more discussions to see what can be done about it. And I do see the importance from Corrado's perspective, because biodiversity is a big part. It's not just like one fish in the ocean or one plant that's there, because it's the potential of what it could achieve, what it could do next, right? So that makes a big difference. So there is the importance and urgency, but it's finding out certain ways to actually get around to do it so that there is a value-driven sense to this biodiversity linked up with NFT and bringing economic value at the end of the day, because those will be the big push, like what whiskey, music, art has done in the NFT space. And yeah, just for information, the Singapore Zoo is doing some tokenization with the pandas at this point. I think my son bought one. They did, yeah. So any thoughts that you have come across a use case that you could parallel to biodiversity as such? Anything that you can think off the top of your head?
Yeah, I'm following a little bit. Is a Estonian startup. Mm-hmm. They are tokenizing nature. They're starting with the forest in the Nordic. The market is probably more mature. So they have literally, if you're a forest owner, today you are looking into what is your revenue streams for that particular forest that you may own. Mm-hmm. And now you have someone that is actually literally trying to put a value to that forest, because they are able to understand what is the carbon sequestration capability of that forest. So all of a sudden you are able to put a value in terms of sequestered tons of CO2. So it's very mainstream along the decarbonization, along the incentive given for companies to be carbon neutral and all looking for offsetting. So they have been able to tokenize, and I think they have a token, a crypto currency that is coming up called Merit, and that Merit has a store value that is tradable. So the company is called Single Earth. is interesting. Again, if you are bringing it to Asia and you start looking into some of the challenges around land use rights in Indonesia, Malaysia, then of course we probably need to start thinking, how do we capture that right, and how do we tokenize it? Because I think it's something that we may not discuss today, but it's also worth discussing as part of the challenges of tokenizing biodiversity, to understand the landscape. And the landscape will be very different if we are talking about Northern Europe, or we are talking about Indonesia and Malaysia.
Okay. We do have some questions from the audience. One of them is actually asking, which you might like to take on, is both of you can take on. Are there any current trends regarding fintech in the biodiversity space that we should be keeping an eye on? So, yeah, both of you can answer these questions.
Yeah, again, I think it's called Single.Earth is an interesting one. And then Rebalancing Earth is another fintech that is worth following.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, on my side, I think I look less on specific kind of biodiversity, but really looking at increasing efficiency in finance, which would naturally lead towards kind of a contribution to lower, footprint, a carbon footprint, and more efficiency and so forth. So from that perspective, I think a lot of what we're seeing in the whole DeFi space, which is really about having a software layer that connects lenders and borrowers and having a more decentralized way of accessing a lot of the financial players, that all those developments are extremely interesting to me. And within that space, there's actually, already a number of iteration of development since last year with regards to what these solutions can be. And it's still a very there's kind of an Cambrian explosion of different ideas going different ways, and not all the ideas work, right? I just want to be very clear. Some of these ideas end up going to dead ends and not working, but a lot of them are really generating the next version of what finance would be. And a lot of this is really on a decentralized basis, right? Mm-hmm. At a very, very simple sense, you have centralized exchanges versus decentralized exchanges. Centralized exchanges probably take thousands of people to run to make sure the code's okay to be on the other side and so forth. And decentralized exchanges probably take, tens of people, right, to make sure that it runs, because the buyer and the sellers are automatically matching with each other on a software layer. So that type of efficiency to really slim down, finance and the people around kind of let's call it the back office and the operations of finance and all the paper that comes with it, all the inefficiency that is attached to it. I think all of that could be improved significantly. And financial systems, I think, go through these revolutionary changes every decade or two because it just costs so much for implementation and so forth. You don't implement a new system for incremental changes. You kind of work with existing systems until something big happens and jumps to the next level. And that's what I feel like we're seeing with all the blockchain systems in terms of driving efficiency.
Agree. I think this is a very interesting space. So there's another question I asked: is there any white paper that it could research a little bit more about biodiversity and NFT? Any other further links around other parts of the world? Because it seems that Europe is a little bit more advanced in this space. And all three of us are not from Europe here, so at this point. So is there anything that you guys are aware of that we could answer the audience about this?
Yeah, I think look at the Convention on Biological Diversity. CBD is an organization. There are a number of white papers being published there, also pertaining to this Protocol of Nagoya, which is basically setting out the rules of engagement in this fair and equitable sharing of information or benefits. There is some, I have come across some work pertaining to DSI and encryption of DSI. And I think there are discussions pertaining what will be the best, the way blockchain will work best in managing this private-public domain. So there is definitely some white papers that I see being developed in the space. But also feel free to reach out, because I'm kind of keen in bringing a little bit of thought leadership in the space, because it is complex. And I think there is a lot of focus when I'm thinking about sustainability. There is a lot of focus about carbon neutrality, but very little about nature positivity. So how do we actually bring nature positive initiatives and not only looking at carbon neutral solutions?
Agree. Well, the good news is that you got a TNFD that's in place now, so there's a lot more look into what's going on in nature. So it's just the next step of discussions, and I'm sure the audience can actually reach out on LinkedIn, because we'll be broadcasting this, and to Corrado, to Benjamin, to know more about NFTs, to know more about biodiversity. If you have more thoughts about it, happy to have more brainstorm sessions, because this is something new. It's what we call very much a blue ocean space. There is a lot of areas that we need to thread to, but it'll be really, really interesting. I think this is a good kickstart between the two of you guys having this discussion. We're actually exploring in this space during Fintech Festival. It's a little bit different from the rest of the topics, which makes it very much more interesting. I think I find it intriguing. A lot of thoughts has to come through. So we've got some good takeaways. Any last words from you guys before we round up the session?
Yeah, I'll jump in for a bit. I think that, I'm very glad we're having these types of conversation. I think it really is showing the evolution of our thoughts and really thinking more not only about ourselves, but more about how we interact with others and with the world. And I think this is what blockchain is built for, really the decentralized nature and bringing kind of consensus together over a wide range of people. So I do feel like, the solution is probably around the corner with the blockchain implementation. I think it's really just a matter of, going through and finding the right iteration to get there.
Yeah, I can't agree more with you, Benjamin. It's just getting to know more and learning much more from your expertise about the NFTs. How about yourself, Corrado? Any last words?
Yeah, I think I will go back to my initial statement that I think we have an assumption that nature is for free, that we can use those resources freely, and we don't really are committed to protect the public good. So I think if we can find ways to incentivize and put a value to nature, put a value to biodiversity, by understanding its economic, together with its challenges, I think we will be really able to spearhead and create what I'm calling nature positive initiatives enabled by technology.
Nice. That's a nice finish it. I'll take you up on the fact that nature was complementary. However, we have abused it, and it's actually about time to think about what we can do to bring back and add value to it, because it's given us so much value in our life. So thank you for you guys. It was really good. There's a very, very healthy, lovely discussion on thought leadership about this topics of NFT, the potential, how it could bring about in biodiversity and sustainability. And in fact, for the people who are watching us on this channel, do check out the Fintech Bridge. There are lots of articles separately on sustainability and transformative DeFi. You can connect with our innovation community and also do listen in to other Singapore Fintech Festival podcasts. And once again, thank you, Corrado, and thank you, Benjamin, and the audience for staying with us throughout this period of time. Cheers.
Thank you.